Reconciliation Day with SABC News.
December 16th is Reconciliation Day in the country. The day was previously known as Dingaan's Day, but was renamed when South Africa became a democratic country. Arts and Culture Minister Nathi Mthethwa says the day is a reminder that in 1994, government set South Africa on a pathway towards a democratic and prosperous society, among others. But some argue that our country is still far from being a fertile ground for all to achieve shared prosperity. So, how do we create a unified, cohesive and reconciled nation? To help us try and get some answers, we're joined by Talkshow host and political commentator Lukhona Mnguni, social justice practitioner and director at LNN Advisors Lovelyn Nwadeyi, and social analyst Tessa Dooms. Good evening to you all, and thank you so much for your time this evening. I'll begin with you, Lovelyn. One of the things that we've heard a lot about today is unity, cohesion, and all of that. But what do you think are some of the obstacles in creating a unified, cohesive and reconciled nation?
Sure. Starting with a big question. Thanks for having us, Ms. Bongiwa. I think for me, what's really resonated a lot today is, are we telling the truth, right? When we try to get people around some kind of narrative of unity, what are we unifying behind and why? And I think that for me is one of the big limitations in South Africa, is that we don't often tell the truth, right? So we hesitant to name, as you call them, some of those obstacles, or when we do name the obstacles, we're often being dishonest in just how broad they are, right? So there are conversations about race that we still need to have in this country that we keep trying to sidestep. There are conversations about the intersections of race, of gender and class, and how that impacts us as a society. There are conversations about a ruling party who were instrumental in the liberation of this country, but have not stayed true to the promise that they made, in the early 90s. And so often, whilst we couch some of the conversations around the ruling party in very liberatory language, the truth is that the experience for people on the ground is not one of liberation, is not one that they can come behind and unify behind. And I think that responsibility for that should sit squarely at their feet. So for me, those are some of my starting thoughts. And as we go, I guess I can offer some more insight into that.
Now, for you, Lukhona, one of the things that I really picked up from Lovelyn, the very first thing, we're not telling the truth, are we?
Well, some will even contest what is the truth, depending on your vantage point in such a contested country. And this is the problem. So one of the issues for me is that we have not sorted out a level playing field where even the contesting meanings of truth can be evaluated and eventually dispense with what we do not believe belongs to the decided register of truth. But I think concepts matter, and I always laugh at this concept of reconciliation. Two lovers who are no longer seeing each other well, you can reconcile them because there was once a point in time that they were reconciled and they were in very conciliatory terms. The sense of trying to reconcile people who never really used to have any degree of affinity to each other, were always combat ready, were always fighting, there was always something at stake. And as a result, the idea of reconciling at its bare, threshold is troublesome. Of course, you can talk, it's the same as words like reconstruction, renewal and rebuild and all these things where you are trying to go back to a past that doesn't really exist. So I think we need also probably sort out the terminology that we use in South Africa about the kind of society that we want to build, because we are now caught up in a situation where we must then decide who is taking back this reconciliation, who is delaying the reconciliation, which partner is actually at the table and ready to move on and has forgiven, but who has apologized, and what have they apologized for? What did they do wrong? Who has acknowledged they're wrong? You can't reconcile people without a sense of acknowledging what is wrong. And we walk in the midst of South Africans who have disproportionately benefited from the oppressive history of this country. who see nothing wrong with the history and the sense of accumulation of the wealth that they have. And therefore, for me, we probably need a new language of what we mean by these things, especially for South Africa.
Tessa, I'm listening to Lukhona talking about the importance of the terminology when it comes to conversations around reconciliation. Some scholars argue that perhaps using the term Ubuntu is better than saying reconciliation. Which school of thought are you leaning towards?
Thanks, Sibonge. I think we need to also ask ourselves questions about, when we bring language and concepts from one place and we try and impose it on a political space and a cultural space where people don't really get the gravity of those words. I think we think about the words on the work of Steve Biko, who really tried to crystallize things like Ubuntu in terms of what it means about humanity and seeing each other as people first before we even think about all of these other social and political constructs that we have assigned to people in order to make sure that we have differential power over them. And so when we talk about Ubuntu, it becomes a very flippant term. It's become extremely flippant in our society to talk about Ubuntu as almost meaning we must just all get along. There are many just vague interpretations of Ubuntu that miss the very central point about Ubuntu, which is about personhood, is about recognizing people's humanity as the central feature of the way in which we construct a society. And we cannot say, and I think Lovelyn is correct about our levels of honesty, we cannot say that we have a shared sense of humanity and that we are recognizing each other's humanity when even at a base level, we are comfortable with the high levels of poverty in our country, with the high levels of inequality in our country, and with even not being willing to acknowledge what racism has done to people's dignity. And not only in the past, but continues to do to people's dignity. When as a Black person, I present as a Black person and I stand in that identity and I'm told, no, race doesn't matter, race isn't real. We shouldn't be using those kind of terms anymore, when that is fully who I am. I come from a community as colored people where apartheid did not only ruin and take away from us many parts of our identity as colored communities that emerged during that time, it also imposed on us identities that we're grappling with still today. So when you come to my community and you tell us that race doesn't exist, it means that you do not see me. You do not see the fullness of me. You do not see my struggles. You do not see my challenges. And you are not seeing the ways in which identity is closely connected to all of those other material issues that I'm facing, like hunger, like struggles of economic opportunity, like unemployment. We cannot divorce those things from each other and then claim to be having an honest conversation in this country.
And as we continue, I'd like us to look at class and race and why this continues then to be, part of the race discussion. But Lukhona, I want to come back to you quickly before I go back to Lovelyn, especially at the back of what Tessa is saying. You know, when you talk about non-racialism, we've seen it become a problem for the Democratic Alliance, especially because they say that, no, you don't see color, but these are South Africans. At the same time, at the back of what Tessa just said, I remember Musi Maimane saying that if you say that you don't see race, you don't see color, then you don't see me as a person. Let's talk about this politics that is a non-racialism politics, but at the same time, you hear leaders then conflicted between that and also trying to appeal or appease even some of the demographics that they lead.
Well, Bongi, all liberation movements agreed that indeed they were fighting for a non-sexist and non-racial society. Now, as you fight for that society, it doesn't mean that there isn't sexism in society, nor there isn't racism in society. I think these are very two different things that we must understand. So there's an aspirational society that you are moving towards, which is quite an ideal form of the society you wish to build. And of course, because idealism is almost perfection and perfection is unattainable, which means you are then always consistently trying to win yourself towards that ideal. The problem are people who want to force non-racialism as a lived experience and reality in South Africa. It is an aspirational value for me. That's where you would like to achieve, where racism, your race does not determine the opportunities that are available to you. Your race does not determine, the social mobility that you have, and the sense of a good life. The quality of your life should not be determined by your race. I mean, we still know that in terms of schooling, there are disproportionate outcomes according to race. In terms of income in the workplace, when you talk about the income inequality divide, we know that race still does matter. But it's not to be bogged down to those issues, really, but simply to say, we push back to those who don't want to see the race, because then they don't want to see the reality of South Africa. But at the same time, we then say, if you are to build a truly non-racial society, what is it that you need to put in place as your basket of policies and your structural rearrangements of society in order for you to get there? And that's the most uncomfortable question for a lot of people. Then they pretend that you are a non-racial society, so that the uncomfortable questions of wealth redistribution, land reform, income disparity gap closure, and all of that do not get addressed. And unfortunately, we cannot accept that.
Now, Lovelyn, the resounding theme, especially when we talk about race and politics in South Africa, is that we cannot do so in the absence of inequality. We cannot not talk about inequality and the impact that it has. There's something that the Arts and Culture Minister said today in his address. He says, for reconciliation to be meaningful, Black people and Black women in particular need to be economically empowered. But does this go far enough?
I mean, I think it would be an important start. I think for me, part of this conversation is really thinking about equity, right? And you hear in, a lot of social justice circles where people will say things like, none of us are free until every Black, trans, poor, woman is free. Because there's something about recognizing that if as a society we're not catering for the most marginalized amongst us, then none of us can experience freedom. None of us can experience full personhood, full dignity, all the stuff that Tessa and Lukhona have been speaking to. And so for me, I think that would be an important start. And I think, going back to the point about language, this is why we do need to talk about some of the concepts that we throw around: the reconciliation, the Ubuntu, the equality, the rainbow nationism, because all of those words are often used to almost railroad people who name very legitimate problems in our society, but are seen as radicals or are seen as extremists, when actually what they're naming is the truth of the material conditions in our country. And actually, we do need to start having a conversation about equity, right? There's no point, and this is a quote one of the teachers I've worked with has really brought to my attention. There's a quote from one of these Greek philosophers, it's either Aristotle or Plato, but where they say, there is nothing more unequal than the equal treatment of unequals. And I think that's what we've done in South Africa, is we've said post-94, we're going to treat everyone the same, but there's a complete disregard for the fact that we're not starting on an equal playing field. And so if you look at, for example, Oxfam released a report last year around women's work and care work in society, and they did a comparison, right? And the gap between what white men in South Africa earn and Black women earn is 6 times, right? So when you look just on racial terms, white people earn about R3.50 more than what Black people earn for every rand. But when you overlay that with gender, you start to see that the gap widens even more to 6 times, right? What a white man earns compared to what a Black woman earns on average, right? And so for me, it becomes important for us to have that conversation, because when that's your starting point for the conversation, to Lukhona's point, we can start to rearrange policies more honestly. We can say, actually, here's what it's going to take to shift our society. When we talk about things like minimum wage, when you say it's okay for people to earn 3.5 a month, you need to ask, who are the people that are going to end up earning that 3.5 a month. And inevitably, it is mostly Black and colored people, mostly Black and colored women, mostly working in care roles, in more unskilled roles. And ultimately, that is the bulk of our population, right? And so it's almost like often people hesitate to talk about identity in relation to these material things because we're scared of the consequence of what that shows us. But actually, policy is for the people. And if policy is going to be for the people, we've got to name who the people are that are earning certain amounts that don't then allow them to have an experience of personhood, of dignity, of Ubuntu, and all these things that we so badly want to champion as part of reconciliation.
Now, Tessa, how does naming help us? Because I'm listening to what Lovelyn is saying, and at the same time, I can't help but think about when when you talk about the unemployment numbers, you're thinking more Black people, but there's almost like a sense of fear to actually say that, okay, it's Black people in bulk who are unemployed. It is women who are still experiencing the brunt of the pay disparities. There's a sense of fear when it comes to talking and having these uncomfortable discussions. How can then, having these uncomfortable discussions help us as a nation actually move ahead quite quicker?
Yeah, I think the first step is acknowledging that you cannot fix something until you can actually point out what's broken. What the apartheid government did and what colonialism did is they named things, right? Apartheid particularly was an actual economic project. It was a project about taking poor white Afrikaner communities and making sure that they could be pulled out of their poverty, and in doing so, pitted them against other groupings in society. And it became a very, race became a way to ensure economic prosperity of a particular group of people in the country who used political power to get economic prosperity at the expense of others. That was the project that was apartheid. And if we're going to counteract that project, what we cannot do is pretend like we can't use those same things, those same markers, and push against them. Number one, we must talk about policy in this country. Apartheid was a policy project. I mean, there were policies for everything, and many of those policies were racialized exactly because the outcome of a racialized society was economically good for some people in that society. We need to go and we need to do policy audits, and we need to see how do our policies talk to dismantling what apartheid did. But there's also a socialization project that apartheid engaged in, a way of getting people to think about themselves and to think about each other in ways that naturalized racism in the society. Today, we have people who we call born-frees in the society. People who are now coming into adulthood even, 20-year-olds, 30-year-olds. But my question is always, who's raising those people? Those people are being raised by people who were born into apartheid and who were taught about the way to see the world through racialized, unequal lenses. So they are born into a free society in terms of time. But in terms of the values that they're being taught at home, we can't really say that those are a post-apartheid set of values, because what apartheid did very successfully is it ingrained in a very almost natural, common sense way that race and the way we see race meant that some people were afforded better opportunities, better life, and a sense of humanity that others weren't. We have to address that socialization. We have to address the way we see each other, talk about each other. And the way to address that is not to pretend none of this existed. Like Lukhona said, we can't pretend like there was a world before that was ideal and now we're trying to get back to it. No, we must recognize that where we come from is a set of conditions that we need to name and we need to push against, and we need to reshape and form a new society. And that's going to take a lot of different elements that will include education, redress, and policy.
Now, Lukhona, one of the things that, we often hear, especially on a day like this one, at the back of what Tessa just said, is the fact that we need to rid South Africa of any legacy of apartheid, of colonialism and all of that. But when you're listening to what she says about the bond freeze, that's the wrong term then, if you agree with the explanation that she's just given us now, that they're not free because they're essentially being raised by people who are conscientized to think in a certain way. So it doesn't look then like the legacies that government wants to eradicate can be done so if we still have such terms as born-frees who are raised by people who are conscientized differently?
Well, I suppose there's also a competing interest between individual identities and collective identities. And I think today we are more worried about the collective identification of the problem that would then lift the bulk majority of South Africans into a place of a good life. I've seen some of these young people called born-frees claim being born-free, and in fact, they have used their agency to switch out of some of the big political problems because indeed they are free, and therefore they'll focus on that which interests them in their lives so that they lead a life that is unburdened really of politics and all of these things. But I like the point that Tessa and Lovelyn are raising about naming the issues in our society, and as a way of example, Bongiwe, to then say, Stats SA tells us that, we're almost at 50% of the expanded definition of unemployment. But if you drill down onto the numbers, for Black women, that stat is at 52, 53%. So they already are above the 50% mark. What it tells you is that all Black women who are of working age are not at work. They are not employed. Now, this is a serious crisis because it then means that there is a structural barrier that is introduced to those Black women for their access to certain forms of agency, access to resources, access to health and reproductive health, and therefore access to what the Constitution guarantees as bodily integrity. And the now late bell hooks, which I think we are all familiar with on the call, used to talk about this intersectional point of, white supremacy, but capitalism and then patriarchy. Now, for you to then translate that intersectionality into policy, you need people like Tessa and Lovelyn in government because they understand nuance. You can't freestyle these things, unfortunately. And I keep making this point that we must be very skeptical of having people in power who do not know half the things that they talk about and the complexities that they talk about. And we must shun this, and we must resist this, and we must do something about it. Because we can have these chats here on SABC any day, but nothing will change because the people who are tasked with the instruments to unlock that policy, those structural impediments, actually do not know the things that we are unpacking here this afternoon.
And Lovelyn, one of the things that I sometimes see and even hear about, and I'm sure you've had a similar experience, especially because given the work that you do, is that there's almost like people are coming from far two different points, and it doesn't look like they're meeting each other halfway. And for example, if a Black person, and I'm going to use race so that it's very specific, if a Black person comes and says, I've just experienced the worst kind of treatment at the hands of maybe either, let's say, a white person in this case, you'll see almost like different comments on social media. Others are saying, but why are you still saying a white person? Why can't you just get over it? Why can't you just say Lovelyn did this to me instead of a Black Lovelyn? Those kinds of conversations make it difficult for us to actually even reconcile. And how does a white person respond to those kinds of conversations? Because it looks like there's a bit of a disconnect. And how does a Black person as well respond in a way that can make the two actually find each other?
Yeah, I think, Sis Bongiwe, socialization is everything, right? And I think that point that Tessa made earlier is a really important one, because our socialization shapes how we see the world, and it shapes how we see each other in relation to each other, and it shapes how we understand things. And so often the he said, she said, it wasn't racism, it was racism. Oh no, it's a personality difference. Oh no, it's not race, it's class. All of those things is rooted in a lack of understanding because we are socialized in very particular ways, right? So there are ways in which, for example, when we think about race in this country, for the most part, right? White people might be aware that they are white. They might know that there's a history to that, but might not walk around with a very nuanced understanding of what it means to be white in society. Whereas from jump, most children of color in this country are made aware quite early on of what it means to be black, of what it means to be colored or Indian. There's a sense of awareness around what that carries, and it sort of follows you everywhere, right? So I think for me, a huge part of this work is around education. What are we teaching? How are we teaching it? And I'm not just talking about the teaching that happens in the classroom, the teaching that happens in formalized education, but there's a hidden curriculum in most of our schools, right? There's stuff that is in the walls. It's what's in the walls. It's what's in the structures of authority. It's in who I see represented as an educator versus who I see represented as a groundsman. And then as a child, where am I locating myself in that structure so that I can start to develop a sense of self? And that happens for children of all races, right? So I think that becomes the first part. The second part is we really need to up the level of our discourse in this country. Yeah, so there's a way in which our social discourse around these issues goes between various extremes, because it's often being manipulated for political ends. And I think that there's a way in which actually our social discourse needs to rest in the agency that people have to really start to think through, how do I as a South African want to make changes, right? So there's a part of this conversation where we can wait for policy to change, but in the meantime, how much do you pay your domestic worker? In the meantime, how are you treating the young black graduates that have just started a program at your company? In the meantime, how do you speak to the women that are part of your team in an organization? In the meantime, what are the jokes that you make about LGBTQI plus people when you're on the sports field with your bras on the weekend, right? So for me, it's like there's a way in which our social discourse needs to shift, apart from waiting for what needs to shift in the policy arena. And that's where individuals need to start activating their agency and making different choices. And those individuals are all of us, right? So in the same way that I do think white people in this country need to make different choices about how they want to exist here. Similarly, as people of color, as women, as men, whatever our identities are, we've got to start making very different choices about how we want to see this country move forward.
Tessa, as we round up this conversation, one of the things that the minister said today, which really struck me, he says join hands, he's calling on South Africans to join hands in a public display of unity in order to foster mutual understanding. It sparked a question in my mind as to, should all citizens bear the responsibility of ensuring that there's reconciliation in the country?
Well, firstly, the minister may want to refrain from telling people to join hands during a pandemic. But yes, we all have a responsibility. We all have to participate in creating a different future. But we have different roles that we need to play, and different contributions we're going to need to make. Some of us are going to need to become more empowered and self-aware. Some of us are going to need to educate ourselves on the history that we come from and the way it's bearing down on our thoughts today. Some of us are going to have to make sacrifices. There is no equality or greater equality without someone making sacrifices. And the people who need to make sacrifices are going to have that conversation with themselves and each other. What we all do have a responsibility to do, though, is not check out. There's a tendency that has developed, particularly amongst socially upwardly mobile Black communities, people who are entering into the middle classes, who have access to opportunities, to then retreat and to check out and to say, well, we're not going to participate in this joint project called South Africa anymore. And if anything that the July riots taught me about this country is that we actually fear each other in this country. We fear that, we'll see people's lives bleeding into our comforts. And we're okay with the chaos and people's lives being in disorder as long as it's far away from us. But the July riots taught us that we are all part of a common place and space and project called South Africa. We must reckon with that. We must reckon with their fate, or the fact that the fate of the least amongst us in terms of opportunities and dignity and rights that have been afforded to people in the society is linked to the people who have obscene amounts of opportunity, privilege, and money. those fates are linked. And until we reckon with that and we realize that we're all part of a common project and that we cannot just be in it, as Lukhona said, for ourselves, we won't make progress. So it must be all of us together, and we must figure out what our individual roles are, the work we need to do as individuals, as individual communities, and then as a joint society. And I think we can do that work, but we do need leadership and courage and a determination to change.
I wish we had more time for this conversation, but thank you so much to you all for your time this afternoon in order just to help us make sense of some of the, areas where we might not actually be seeing, change, but also how do we navigate some of the difficult spaces that we face on a daily basis. Thank you so much to you all for your time this afternoon. That was talk show host and political commentator Lukhona Mnguni, social justice practitioner and director of L&N Advisors Lovelyn Nwadeyi, and social analyst Tessa Dooms.